To understand boxing, we must first confront a fundamental, inescapable truth about human nature and our biological evolution. Before the invention of the wheel, before the forging of bronze, and long before the first words were pressed into wet clay tablets, there was the fist, the act of closing one's hand, folding the fingers tight against the palm, and locking the thumb across the knuckles to create a dense, heavy bludgeon of bone and tissue, is perhaps the oldest, most instinctual form of human combat. It requires no forged steel, no carved wood, and no complex technology. It is a weapon born directly from our anatomy. But boxing is not merely fighting. Fighting is chaotic, driven by survival, panic, and unregulated aggression. Boxing represents something far more profound in the development of human civilization. Boxing is the precise moment when raw, chaotic violence was distilled into a structured, regulated contest. It is the moment when we took our most primal instinct for destruction and subjected it to rules, honor, and physical boundaries. It is the moment when violence became an art form. The earliest visual evidence of this transition does not come from the grand arenas of Greece or Rome, but from the very cradle of human civilization itself. In the Sumerian caves of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, archaeologists have discovered stone reliefs dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. Carved into these ancient stones are figures facing each other with raised fists, but they are not just brawling. Their wrists and knuckles are deliberately wrapped in protective cloth. This simple act of wrapping the hands signifies premeditation, preparation, and an understanding that this is a sport, not a battle for survival. Similar depictions appear in ancient Egyptian tombs, dating to around 1350 BCE, found in the Theban necropolis. These hieroglyphic paintings show fighters competing in front of a pharaoh. Their movements, captured in profile, are remarkably similar to a modern boxer's stance, the lead arm extended to measure distance and deflect incoming blows, the rear hand held close to the face to protect the chin, and the weight distributed to allow for sudden forward momentum. Yet another remarkable piece of evidence comes from the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. The famous Boxing Boys fresco, discovered in the ruins of Akrotiri and dating back to roughly 1650 BCE, depicts two young boys engaged in a bout. They wear belts and loincloths, and most astonishingly, they wear what appear to be primitive boxing gloves on their hands. These scattered archaeological fragments tell us that across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, humanity had already begun the process of ritualizing combat. But it was the ancient Greeks who would take this rudimentary martial exercise and elevate it into a deeply philosophical, highly respected, and brutally violent athletic spectacle. The ancient Greeks did not view physical prowess as separate from intellectual or spiritual virtue. They believed the two were inextricably linked. To develop the body to its absolute physical peak was considered a form of divine worship, a way of honoring the gods who possessed perfect physical forms. Within this culture, combat sports were revered above all others. They called their form of boxing pygmakia, a word derived from pyx, meaning clenched fist, and mache, meaning battle. By 688 BCE, pygmakia had become so integral to Greek culture that it was officially introduced to the 23rd ancient Olympic Games. To a modern observer accustomed to the regulated safety of contemporary boxing, an Olympic pygmakia match in ancient Greece would look like absolute, terrifying barbarism. The sport was stripped of almost all the safety nets we rely on today. There was no elevated, squared ring. There were no ropes to lean against when exhausted, and no corners to retreat to for rest and instruction. The fighters simply met in an open space on the ground, heavily covered in loose sand, known as the skama. The sand served a dual purpose. It absorbed the blood, and it made footwork incredibly difficult, forcing the fighters to plant their feet and generate power from a static position. Furthermore, there were no weight classes. A young, lightning-fast fighter weighing 140 pounds could be matched against a towering, heavily muscled giant weighing 250 pounds. The Greeks believed that superior skill, tactical intelligence, and the favor of the gods should be enough to overcome any disparity in sheer physical mass. The concept of time in the ancient ring was entirely fluid. There were no 3-minute rounds, and there were no rest periods. There was no bell to save a fighter who was hurt. A match began, and it continued continuously, without a single interruption, until one of three things happened. One man was knocked completely unconscious. One man was so battered he could no longer stand. stand, or a fighter voluntarily surrendered by raising a single index finger to the sky. Because they fought on shifting sand and lacked the confined space of a modern ring to trap an opponent, ancient Greek boxing involved very little of the dancing footwork we see today. The fighters stood relatively stationary, facing each other squarely. The primary targets were the head and the face. Striking the muscular torso of a well-conditioned Greek athlete was considered a waste of precious energy. The goal was blunt force trauma to the skull. The most terrifying aspect of pygmachia, however, was the equipment. The Greeks did not use padded gloves designed to absorb impact. Instead, they wrapped their hands and wrists in heavy leather thongs called himantes. In the early centuries of the sport, these wraps, known as soft himantes, were made of pliable ox hide dressed with fat to keep them supple. Their sole purpose was to bind the bones of the hand and wrist tightly together, preventing the striker's knuckles from shattering against the hard bone of their opponent's forehead or jaw. They offered absolutely no protection to the person being hit. But as the sport evolved into the Hellenistic period, the culture demanded more visible damage and faster resolutions to the grueling matches. The Greeks introduced the hard himantes. These were terrifying weapons. They consisted of thick, hardened leather bands, often with sharp, raised edges, strapped across the knuckles. The soft leather was moved up to cover the forearm, leaving the knuckles armed with hardened ridges. These wraps were no longer just for protecting the hands. They were designed specifically to cut, tear, and disfigure the opponent's face with every glancing blow. Despite the sheer savagery of the physical exchange, the Greeks deeply respected the defensive, tactical mind over brute strength. The most legendary boxer of antiquity was a man named Melanchthonus of Caria, who won the Olympic championship in 49 CE. Historical accounts written by Dio Chrysostom claim that Melanchthonus was the most magnificent athlete of his era, possessing a body of unparalleled beauty and conditioning. But his true legend lies in his fighting style. Melanchthonus, it is written, never once threw a punch in competition, nor was he ever struck by an opponent. His philosophy was that to be struck was a failure of defense, and to strike another man was an unnecessary expenditure of energy that relied on chance. Instead, his physical conditioning was so absolute, and his defensive footwork and head movement were so incredibly precise that he simply evaded, slipped, and deflected every single strike thrown his way. He would keep his arms raised in a defensive guard for hours on end, never tiring. He would frustrate his opponents, forcing them to swing wildly at the empty air until they completely exhausted themselves under the blazing Mediterranean sun. Eventually, gasping for breath, their muscles failing, his opponents would simply collapse from sheer exhaustion and frustration, raising their index fingers in defeat to a man who had never even touched them. Melanchthonus was the ancient philosophical embodiment of the sweet science, the art of winning without getting hit. When the Roman Empire conquered Greece, they absorbed the vast majority of Greek culture, including their sports. But the Romans were a pragmatic, militaristic, and bloodthirsty society. They took the noble, athletic tradition of pygmachia, stripped it of its philosophical and spiritual underpinnings, and mutated it into a lethal spectacle for the gladiatorial arenas. The Romans looked at the Greek leather himantes and decided they simply were not lethal enough for a crowd that demanded blood and death. They invented a new piece of equipment called the cestus. The cestus was a nightmare of ancient engineering. It was a heavy leather glove or wrap, but it was heavily reinforced with hardened iron plates, lead weights, metal studs, and sometimes even heavy metal spikes or shards of broken glass sewn into the leather over the knuckles. Boxing in the Roman Empire was rarely a contest between free athletes seeking glory. It was predominantly fought by slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals who were forced into the amphitheaters to fight for the amusement of the mob. The fighters wearing the caestus would bludgeon each other in the sand of the Colosseum. The strikes generated by the caestus were so devastatingly heavy that a single, well-placed blow to the head could easily crush a cheekbone, shatter a jaw, or cave in a skull, resulting in instant death. Matches were brief, incredibly violent, and almost always ended in a fatality or permanent, catastrophic disfigurement. The Romans had taken a sport of endurance and skill and turned it into an execution by blunt force trauma. The sheer butchery of Roman gladiatorial boxing eventually caused the sport to fall out of favor, particularly as the empire began to adopt Christianity. The new religious doctrine placed a heavy emphasis on the sanctity of the human body as a creation of God. In the year 393 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I banned the Olympic Games entirely, viewing them as a pagan ritual dedicated to false gods. And finally, around 500 CE, Theodoric the Great, the king of the Ostrogoths who ruled Italy, officially banned the use of the cestus and the sport of boxing altogether. He declared it a grave offense against God to deliberately and violently disfigure the human face, which was made in God's image. For nearly 1,000 years, organized, regulated boxing completely vanished from the historical record. The world descended into the Middle Ages, an era dominated by feudalism, knights, broadswords, plate armor, and siege warfare. The disciplined, scientific art of the fist was buried in the sands of antiquity, forgotten by a world that had moved on to steel. It would not emerge again until the late 17th century in the damp, foggy, rapidly industrializing streets of England. The rebirth of boxing occurred not in grand marble arenas, but in the chaotic, bustling, and filthy cities of late 17th century England. As the population moved from the countryside into the densely packed urban centers of London, violence was an everyday reality. Disputes over money, gambling, and honor were frequently settled with fists in the streets. Gradually, this chaotic street fighting began to draw spectators, and where there are spectators, there is gambling. Boxing re-emerged as a popular attraction at country fairs, outside taverns, and in the private gardens of wealthy aristocrats who would sponsor local strongmen to fight each other for heavy wagers. The first recognized champion of this rough, unregulated new era was a formidable man named James Figg. In 1719, Figg opened an amphitheater on Tottenham Court Road in London, where he set up an academy to teach the noble science of defense. It is crucial to understand that James Figg was not a boxer in the modern sense. He was a master of weaponry, specifically the broadsword, the backsword, and the wooden quarterstaff, but he also fought with his bare fists. Figg's style of boxing closely resembled fencing without the blade. He taught his students to stand completely bladed sideways to their opponent, keeping their distance and leaping in and out to deliver straight, linear blows. During Figg's era, there were absolutely no rules. It was a crude, brutal form of hand-to-hand combat. Eye-gouging, head-butting, kicking, biting, and choking were occasionally frowned upon by the gentler members of the audience. But essentially, a fight was a fight. You did whatever was necessary to break your opponent before they broke you. It was a back-alley brawl, masquerading as a sport. The man who would finally drag boxing out of the gutter, apply a sense of geometry and physics to the chaos, and give the sport a civilized structure was one of James Figg's top students, a heavyweight fighter named Jack Broughton. Jack Broughton is widely revered today as the father of the English school of boxing. He possessed a brilliant tactical mind. Where James Figg relied on brute strength and linear fencing attacks, Broughton introduced the concepts of parrying incoming blows, pulling the head backward to avoid punches, and utilizing lateral footwork to create angles of attack. He was the first to realize that you could use your opponent's momentum against them. But Broughton's greatest, most lasting contribution to the sport came in the traumatic aftermath of a tragedy. In April 1741, Broughton fought a tough, relentless man named George Stephenson, known as the Coachman. The fight was a grueling, savage affair that lasted for nearly an hour of uninterrupted violence. Broughton systematically battered Stephenson, ultimately landing a devastating blow beneath the heart that dropped the Coachman to the dirt. Stephenson was carried out of the ring, severely injured. A few days later, George Stephenson died from internal trauma. Broughton was deeply traumatized by the death of his opponent. Furthermore, he possessed the foresight to realize that if men continued to die in the ring, the British government would step in and completely outlaw the sport he loved, just as the Romans had done centuries before. Boxing required boundaries. In 1743, Jack Broughton sat down and drafted the first unified code of rules rules for the sport of boxing. Broughton's rules were simple, but they were revolutionary, and they established the absolute framework for the sport we know today. First, Broughton's rules established the physical boundaries of the fight. He mandated a square ring, measuring exactly a yard across, completely cordoned off by ropes and posts. This was not just to keep the fighters in, it was to keep the surging, often drunken, and violent crowd out, ensuring the fighters had a fair, uninterrupted space to compete. Second, he introduced the concept of the scratch. Broughton mandated that a square be drawn with chalk in the exact center of the ring. If a man was knocked down, the action stopped immediately. The downed fighter's cornermen were allowed to pick him up and tend to him. The fighter then had exactly half a minute, 30 seconds, to recover. After 30 seconds, the fighter had to return to the center of the ring and place his foot on the chalk square, unaided. If he could not make it to the scratch line under his own power within 30 seconds, the fight was officially over, and he was declared the loser. This rule fundamentally changed the sport, introducing a time limit for recovery and preventing unconscious men from being beaten further. It is also the origin of the common English idiom, up to scratch, meaning to be fit or capable enough to perform a task. Furthermore, Broughton strictly forbade hitting a man when he was down, a common practice in the chaotic days of James Figg. He also banned the gripping of an opponent anywhere below the waist, effectively separating boxing from wrestling. Crucially, Jack Broughton also invented the first boxing gloves. He called them mufflers. They were heavily padded leather mitts, much larger and softer than modern gloves, filled tightly with horsehair or sheep's wool. However, it is a massive historical misconception that these mufflers were used in actual fights. They were not. In the 18th century, paying to see men fight with padded hands was considered cowardly. Mufflers were used exclusively for sparring and training in Broughton's academy. They were designed to protect the faces, noses, and teeth of the wealthy noblemen and aristocrats who paid handsomely for boxing lessons, but could not afford to return to high society with black eyes and broken jaws. When it came to actual professional prize fights, where heavy wagers were placed, the men still stripped to the waist and fought completely bare-knuckled. The bare-knuckle era of the late 18th and 19th centuries was a grueling, bloody spectacle of absolute human attrition. The fights were held outdoors, in fields and pastures, subjecting the fighters to the blistering heat of the sun, torrential rain, and biting wind. To understand how these men fought, you must understand the physiology of the human hand. Without the protection of heavily wrapped cloth and padded leather gloves, a fighter's hands are incredibly fragile instruments. The metacarpal bones in the human hand will easily fracture and shatter long before the dense, thick bone of a human skull breaks. Therefore, bare-knuckle boxers rarely threw the heavy, looping headshots, overhand rights, and crushing hooks to the jaw that we see in modern boxing. Throwing a full-force punch at a man's forehead with a bare fist is a guaranteed way to break your own hand, effectively ending your ability to fight. Instead, bare-knuckle boxing was a game of precision, body blows, and grappling. Boxers targeted the softer tissue, the rib cage, the solar plexus, the throat, and the very tip of the chin. They held their hands much lower than modern boxers, keeping their arms across their stomachs and chests to protect their internal organs, leaning their heads backward, out of range. The fights were also essentially brutal, standing wrestling matches, under the revised London prize ring rules of 1838, which updated Broughton's original code. Grappling was entirely legal, as long as the holds were maintained above the opponent's waist. A fighter could clinch, seize his opponent around the neck in a headlock, deliver devastating short-range blows to the face, and then violently cross-buttock or hip-toss him to the hard, unyielding turf. A round did not have a set time limit. A round only ended when one man was knocked down by a punch or thrown to the ground in a grapple. There was no bell. A round could last 10 seconds if there was a quick knockdown, or it could last an agonizing 10 or 15 minutes of continuous, exhausting grappling and striking. Once a man went down, the 30-second recovery period began, followed by the call to the scratch line. Because of this structure, bare-knuckle fights went on for hours. They were tests of superhuman endurance, pain tolerance, and raw survival. The era produced legendary figures. Perhaps the most important was Daniel Mendoza, a Jewish fighter operating in the late 18th century. At a time when anti-Semitism was rampant in England, Mendoza became a national hero. He was relatively small, weighing only 160 pounds, often fighting men much larger and heavier than himself. Mendoza realized he could not survive by by trading heavy blows with giants. He completely revolutionized the sport by introducing rapid, darting footwork, the concept of the fast, stinging left jab to blind and distract his opponents, and the art of sidestepping attacks. He authored a book titled The Art of Boxing, teaching that defense was just as critical as offense. He proved that intelligence, speed, and strategy, what he called the science of pugilism, could reliably defeat brute strength and ignorant aggression. The early 19th century saw massive, epic-defining clashes. In 1810 and 1811, the English champion Tom Cribb fought two legendary bouts against Tom Molyneux, an emancipated American slave who had traveled to England seeking glory. These fights drew tens of thousands of spectators, creating a massive, frenzied, nationalistic fervor. The fights were brutal, spanning dozens of rounds, with both men suffering broken bones, closed eyes, and horrific exhaustion, ultimately ending in Cribb's victory. In 1856, a legendary bare-knuckle bout between James Kelly and Jonathan Smith in Australia lasted for an agonizing 6 hours and 15 minutes. They fought for over 100 rounds, their hands swollen and broken, their faces unrecognizable, continuing purely on adrenaline and an unbreakable refusal to quit. But as the 19th century progressed, the Victorian era dawned. Society was industrializing, and cultural sensibilities were shifting toward a desire for order, refinement, and propriety. The societal tolerance for bloody, endless, bare-knuckle brawls began to rapidly wane. These events were frequently associated with illegal gambling, mob violence, organized crime, and public drunkenness. The police began actively raiding prize fights, deploying officers to break up the rings and arrest the participants. The sport was pushed deep into the shadows. Promoters had to hold fights in secret locations on the outskirts of towns, in remote barns, or on barges floating down the Thames to avoid the jurisdiction of local magistrates. Boxing was dying. It was viewed as a savage relic of a less civilized past. To survive the modern era, the sport needed a complete revolution. It needed a final, strict code of laws that would permanently sever its ties with back-alley brawling and transform it into a legitimate, scientifically regulated, and respectable athletic contest. That revolution arrived in 1867, bearing the name of a Scottish nobleman. In 1867, a Welsh sportsman named John Graham Chambers, a member of the British Amateur Athletic Club, drafted a new set of rules specifically designed for amateur boxing matches in London. He wanted to create a version of the sport that prioritized speed, skill, and athleticism over sheer, bloody endurance and wrestling. To lend his new rules prestige and social acceptability, Chambers approached his friend, John Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry. Douglas agreed to publicly endorse the code. The rules were published under his name, and the Marquess of Queensberry rules would forever change the trajectory of human combat. The Queensberry rules stripped away the wrestling, the throwing, and the chaotic, open-ended endurance of the bare-knuckle era. They established the absolute foundation of modern, scientific boxing. First, they mandated that all fights must take place in a perfectly squared ring, measuring exactly 24 feet on each side, firmly surrounded by strong ropes. Second, and most fundamentally altering to the physiology of the sport, the rules introduced strict 3-minute rounds, separated by a mandatory 1-minute rest period. This simple change in timekeeping changed everything. In the bare-knuckle era, fighters had to drastically pace themselves, constantly conserving energy for a fight that might last 5 hours. With the introduction of the 3-minute round, a fighter knew exactly how long he had to work before he received rest. Boxers could now exert explosive, high-intensity energy, bouncing on their toes, throwing rapid combinations, and moving constantly for 3 minutes, knowing relief was coming. It drastically increased the speed, action, and pure athleticism of the bouts. Third, the rules mandated the wearing of fair-sized boxing gloves of the best quality, new and well-fitting. This was the paradigm shift. The introduction of the padded leather glove was not necessarily intended to protect the brain of the fighter being hit. It was designed primarily to protect the fragile bones in the hands of the fighter throwing the punch. With their hands safely encased in heavy cloth wraps and thick layers of padded horsehair, the biomechanics of punching changed overnight. Boxers no longer had to fear shattering their hands on a skull. They could suddenly throw incredibly heavy, devastating, full-torque strikes directly at the hard bone of the jaw and the temples. Because the head was now the primary, heavily targeted zone, Defensive stances had to evolve instantly. Boxers could no longer keep their hands low by their waist. They had to raise their guards, holding their heavily gloved hands high to protect their heads, giving birth to the high, tight, modern boxing stance we recognize today. Finally, the Queensberry rules established the modern 10-second knockout. If a fighter was knocked down by a punch, his opponent had to retreat to a neutral corner. The downed fighter was not dragged to a scratch line by his cornerman. He had exactly 10 seconds to rise from the canvas entirely under his own power. If he failed to beat the referee's count, the fight was over by knockout. The transition from the brutal bare-knuckle traditions to the refined Queensberry rules did not happen overnight. For a period of about 25 years, the two styles coexisted, with fighters often blending the techniques or agreeing to fight under whichever rules the financial backers preferred. But the ultimate symbolic turning point, the death of the old world and the birth of the new, occurred on September 7, 1892, at the Olympic Club in New Orleans, Louisiana. John L. Sullivan was the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, and he was the last great king of the bare-knuckle era. Known as the Boston Strong Boy, Sullivan was a massive, ferocious, hard-drinking brawler who relied on terrifying aggression and crushing, looping power punches to overwhelm his opponents. He stepped into the ring that night to defend his title against a completely new breed of fighter, James J. Corbett. Corbett, famously known as Gentleman Jim, was a former bank clerk from California. He was highly educated, articulate, and he had studied the nuances of the Queensberry rules meticulously. He understood that with padded gloves on, defense, distance management, and footwork were paramount. When the bell rang, Sullivan charged forward, adopting his archaic bare-knuckle stance, swinging wild, incredibly heavy blows intended to crush Corbett against the ropes. But Corbett simply wasn't there. Corbett danced. He utilized rapid lateral movement, circling away from Sullivan's power hand. He employed the fast, snapping left jab to continually disrupt Sullivan's forward momentum, blinding him and bloodying his nose. When Sullivan missed wildly, Corbett would step in, deliver a precise, sharp counterpunch, and immediately pivot out of range before Sullivan could retaliate. For 21 exhausting rounds, Corbett frustrated the charging, enraged champion. Sullivan, unaccustomed to chasing a moving target and worn down by the rapid pace of the 3-minute rounds, slowly began to fade. His massive legs grew heavy. Finally, in the 21st round, exhausted, battered, and utterly bewildered by Corbett's scientific approach, Sullivan was knocked out by a crisp, perfectly timed right hand. The bare-knuckle era died on the canvas that night in New Orleans. The age of the gloved, scientific boxer had officially begun, setting the stage for the massive global spectacle of the 20th century. As the 20th century dawned, boxing transitioned from a fringe, occasionally illegal activity into a massive, organized global commercial enterprise. The heavyweight champion of the world was arguably the most famous and culturally significant athlete on the planet, but the sport was also deeply intertwined with the complex, ugly racial and social politics of the era. For decades, the heavyweight championship was exclusively held by white men. A strict, unspoken color line was drawn. White champions absolutely refused to fight black challengers for the title, fearing the societal implications of a black man physically dominating a white man on a global stage and claiming the ultimate symbol of physical supremacy. This barrier was finally shattered by a man of unparalleled brilliance, defiance, and defensive genius, Jack Johnson. Born in Galveston, Texas, Johnson was a towering, massively powerful man, but he did not fight like a brawler. He was a master of the sweet science. He perfected the art of fighting on the inside, utilizing the clinch not just to rest, but to control his opponent's balance, drain their energy, and set up short, devastating uppercuts. Johnson's defensive reflexes were supernatural. He would catch incoming punches out of the air with his open gloves. He would lean his head back just a fraction of an inch, letting heavy hooks breeze past his chin, and then he would smile. He frequently engaged in conversation with his opponents, their cornermen, and the ringside press while he was actively fighting, utterly unfazed by the violence surrounding him. In 1908, after relentlessly pursuing the reigning champion Tommy Burns around the globe, Johnson finally cornered him in Sydney, Australia. Burns agreed to the fight for a massive sum of money. Johnson systematically and effortlessly dismantled Burns, mocking him as he battered him until the local police stepped into the ring and stopped the fight in the 14th round, terrified of a riot. Jack Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion of the world. His victory sent shockwaves through a deeply segregated America. It sparked massive societal upheaval and a frantic, culturally obsessive search by the white establishment for a great white hope, a fighter who could dethrone Johnson and restore the racial hierarchy they believed the heavyweight title represented. This obsessive search culminated on July 4, 1910, in Reno, Nevada, in a fight billed as the Fight of the Century. Jim Jeffries, a massive, undefeated former heavyweight champion, was coaxed out of a 6-year retirement and an alfalfa farm to fight Johnson. The atmosphere in Reno was incredibly tense, saturated with racial animosity. A massive, temporary wooden stadium was constructed in the desert specifically for the event. Tens of thousands of men in boater hats packed the searing hot arena. When the bell rang, the myth of the Great White Hope was brutally deconstructed. Jeffries, older and slower, charged forward in a low crouch, attempting to bull Johnson into the ropes. But Johnson was a master of leverage. He easily tied Jeffries up in the clinch, neutralizing his power. As the fight progressed under the brutal Nevada sun, Johnson put on a masterclass of defensive boxing and sharp counterpunching. He cut Jeffries' face to ribbons. By the 15th round, Jeffries was a bloody, exhausted shell. Johnson hit him with a sequence of lefts and rights that sent the massive former champion crashing through the ropes and onto the apron. Jeffries was knocked out. Johnson's victory cemented his absolute dominance, but it also ignited race riots across the United States. He lived his life with unapologetic defiance, refusing to conform to the expectations of a segregated society. He drove fast cars, wore expensive tailored suits, and openly flaunted the racist laws of the era, eventually being targeted by the federal government and forced into exile. Jack Johnson proved that boxing was no longer just a sport. It was a mirror reflecting the deepest tensions and realities of society itself. As America entered the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, the culture shifted toward mass entertainment, rapid consumption, and incredible spectacle. Boxing required a new kind of hero, a fighter who matched the explosive, frenetic energy of the decade. They found him in a former hobo and barroom brawler from Colorado named Jack Dempsey. Dempsey, universally known as the Manasseh Mauler, pioneered a radically aggressive, terrifyingly violent style of boxing that had never been seen before. He was relatively small for a heavyweight, rarely weighing over 190 pounds, but he possessed dynamite in both fists and a ferocious, predatory instinct. Dempsey abandoned the upright, measured stance of the Corbett and Johnson era. He adopted a deep, coiled crouch. He utilized a technique that would become famously known as the Dempsey roll. To execute the Dempsey roll, he would drop his center of gravity, keeping his hands low, and begin bobbing and weaving his head and upper body in an aggressive, continuous figure-8 motion as he rapidly advanced on his opponent. This constant, rolling movement made his head an incredibly difficult, unpredictable target to hit. More importantly, the figure-8 motion functioned like a coiled spring. As he rolled his weight from his left foot to his right foot, he generated massive, rotational kinetic energy in his hips and shoulders. When he finally unleashed a hook, all of that pent-up torque snapped through his arm, delivering the entire mass of his moving body into the strike. It was biomechanically devastating. Dempsey's fights were not scientific chess matches, they were explosive executions. He destroyed the massive Jess Willard to win the title in 1919, knocking the giant down 7 times in the first round alone, shattering Willard's jaw and ribs. Dempsey's ferocious style coincided perfectly with 2 massive developments in American culture: the rise of the superstar sports promoter led by a visionary named Tex Rickard and the invention of commercial radio broadcasting. Tex Rickard understood that boxing could be marketed not just to hardcore fight fans, but to high society, celebrities, and women. He promoted Dempsey's fights as massive cultural events. In 1921, Rickard matched Dempsey against a highly decorated French war hero named Georges Carpentier. Rickard built a massive 90,000-seat wooden arena in Jersey City specifically for the bout. It generated the first $1 million gate in the history of sports. Over 90,000 people packed walked into the stadium, a sea of straw hats and tailored suits. But even more significantly, the fight was broadcast live via radio. For the first time in human history, millions of people sitting in their living rooms across the country, gathered around wooden radio cabinets, could experience the tension, the roar of the crowd, and the violent drama of a championship fight in real time. The staccato voice of the radio announcer describing Dempsey's brutal hooks brought the violence of the ring directly into the domestic sphere. Boxing became the soundtrack of the 1920s, and Jack Dempsey became one of the most famous men on earth, establishing the blueprint for the modern athletic superstar. If Jack Dempsey made boxing a massive commercial spectacle, it was a quiet, stoic fighter from Detroit who transformed the heavyweight championship into a symbol of global geopolitical significance. His name was Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. Joe Louis became heavyweight champion in 1937, ending a long drought of black champions that had existed since the exile of Jack Johnson. But unlike Johnson, Louis was managed carefully to appeal to the white American public. He was instructed never to smile over a fallen opponent, never to gloat, and to maintain an aura of quiet, devastating professionalism. And devastating he was. Joe Louis possessed perhaps the most technically perfect, mechanically flawless punches in the history of the heavyweight division. He did not rely on the wild, leaping hooks of Dempsey. Louis threw incredibly short, compact, perfectly straight punches. He transferred his weight flawlessly from his back foot, twisting his hips and delivering maximum power with zero wasted motion. A 6-inch punch from Joe Louis generated enough force to instantly separate a man from his consciousness. Louis's defining moment, and perhaps the most culturally significant fight in boxing history, occurred on June 22, 1938, at Yankee Stadium in New York. It was a rematch against the German former champion, Max Schmeling. 2 years earlier, Schmeling had shocked the world by knocking out a young, overconfident Joe Louis, exploiting a flaw in Louis' habit of dropping his left hand after throwing a jab. By 1938, the world was on the precipice of World War II. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime had co-opted Schmeling's victory, proclaiming him a symbol of Aryan supremacy, despite Schmeling himself not being a member of the Nazi Party. When they met for the rematch, Joe Louis was no longer just a boxer. He was fighting as the symbolic representative of the United States, of democracy, and of the repudiation of Nazi ideology. The entire world listened to the radio broadcast, fully aware of the political weight resting on the fighter's shoulders. The fight lasted exactly 2 minutes and 4 seconds. From the opening bell, Louis unleashed a terrifying, methodical barrage of perfect, compact violence. He trapped Schmeling against the ropes and delivered a sequence of paralyzing blows to the head and the body. One particularly vicious right hand to Schmeling's ribs was so hard that it fractured vertebrae in the German's back, causing him to cry out in agony, a sound picked up by the ringside microphones and broadcast to millions. Schmeling was knocked down 3 times in the first round before his corner threw in the towel. Joe Louis had annihilated the symbol of Nazi supremacy in just over 2 minutes. He became an undisputed national hero, transcending race in a deeply divided America and holding the heavyweight championship for a record-breaking 12 years, defending it 25 times. He proved the devastating effectiveness of pure economical biomechanics. As the 20th century progressed into its latter half, the technical evolution of boxing reached its absolute zenith. Trainers and fighters began to understand the strict, unforgiving biomechanics of the human body with scientific precision. Fighters developed distinct, highly specialized styles tailored to their own physical attributes. We saw the unparalleled fluidity and combination punching of Sugar Ray Robinson, widely considered the greatest pound-for-pound fighter in history, who danced around the ring connecting punches with the rhythm of a jazz drummer. We saw the suffocating, relentless inside pressure of fighters like Joe Frazier and the impenetrable shoulder roll defense perfected by Floyd Mayweather Jr., relying on micro-adjustments and inhuman reflexes to deflect punches off the lead shoulder and counter with sniper-like accuracy. But no fighter defined the modern era or the cultural power of boxing, quite like Muhammad Ali. Ali, originally Cassius Clay, completely broke the mold of how a heavyweight was supposed to fight and how they were supposed to act. Heavyweights were expected to be slow, plodding power punchers. Ali fought with his hands down by his waist, a cardinal sin in boxing textbooks. He relied entirely on his blinding foot speed, his ability to glide across the canvas, and his extraordinary reflexes, leaning his head straight backward to evade heavy punches by fractions of an inch. He famously, poetically declared that he would float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. But Ali's true genius lay in his understanding that boxing was not just about physical mechanics. It was about intense, grueling, psychological warfare. Ali revolutionized the concept of trash talk. He used poetry, insults, and relentless media manipulation to anger, confuse, and mentally break his opponents before they even stepped through the ropes. He taunted the terrifying Sonny Liston, calling him a big, ugly bear. He infuriated Joe Frazier, turning their rivalry into a bitter, blood feud epic that culminated in the brutal, near-lethal Thrilla in Manila. His strategic masterpiece came in 1974 in Zaire, Africa, against the massive, undefeated, and terrifyingly powerful George Foreman. The fight was dubbed the Rumble in the Jungle. Everyone expected Ali to use his speed and dance away from Foreman. Instead, Ali invented the rope-a-dope strategy. He leaned back against the loose ring ropes, covered his head with his gloves, and allowed the massive Foreman to pound away at his arms and body for round after round in the suffocating African heat. Ali absorbed the punishment, taunting Foreman, whispering in his ear, "Is that all you got, George?" Foreman punched himself into a state of absolute, total muscular exhaustion. By the 8th round, Foreman's arms were heavy, his lungs were burning, and his punches had lost their snap. Ali suddenly exploded off the ropes, delivering a lightning-fast combination, ending with a straight right hand that sent the exhausted giant crashing to the canvas. It was a triumph of intellect and psychological endurance over raw, physical power. To watch a high-level boxing match, to truly understand what is happening inside the ring, is to witness the absolute, terrifying limit of human athletic capability and physiological endurance. The physiology of a fight is staggering. Consider what happens during a knockout. When a fighter is struck cleanly on the point of the chin by a professional boxer, the head is subjected to massive, instantaneous rotational acceleration. The human brain is not bolted down. It is suspended in a bath of cerebrospinal fluid inside the skull. When the jaw is struck, the skull violently snaps to the side, but because of inertia, the gelatinous mass of the brain lags behind for a fraction of a millisecond. The brain then crashes into the hard interior wall of the skull, bounces, and crashes into the opposite side. This violent rotational trauma physically twists and stretches the brainstem. Specifically, it disrupts a network of neurons called the reticular activating system, which is responsible for maintaining human consciousness and wakefulness. When this system is violently disrupted, the brain essentially undergoes a sudden, hard electrical reboot. The fighter's nervous system instantly shuts down the signals, keeping the muscles tense. Their legs turn to liquid, their eyes roll back, and they collapse limply to the canvas. That is the brutal anatomy of a knockout. To avoid this fate, a boxer must perform miraculous feats of calculation under extreme duress. While standing in front of a man trying to separate him from his consciousness, a boxer must process visual information, calculate the precise distance in millimeters, predict their opponent's intention based on micro-twitches in their shoulder or the shifting of their hips, and execute a physical evasion, a block, or a counterattack. They must do all of this in less than 0.2 of a second, the time it takes for a fast jab to travel from the shoulder to the chin, and they must continue to do this flawlessly, round after round, while suffering from extreme physical exhaustion, lactic acid building in their muscles, blood pooling in their eyes, and the roaring pressure of a stadium crowd. From the blood-soaked, shifting sands of ancient Greece to the blinding neon lights of Las Vegas arenas, the history of boxing is the story of humanity's attempt to govern its own darkest aggression. It is a sport of brutal honesty. You cannot play boxing. There are no teammates to pass the ball to when you are tired. When the bell rings, the fighter is utterly, profoundly alone, stripped of all pretense and societal protection. It is a brutal sport, an unforgiving sport, and for many who stay too long, a tragic sport, yet it remains undeniably compelling. It is the sweet science, a highly complex, high-speed physical chess match where the stakes are absolute, and the ultimate, unvarnished truth of a human being's character, courage, and will to survive is stripped bare under the stadium lights.